It's magical because what you're able to do then is create action from a distance. You have your will, and you can impart that will at no matter what the time and space is. If you consider more of an academic view of what magic is, you could make the argument that Baphomet is a magical icon.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Truth and Shadow. You know, sometimes I wonder what compels us to keep searching, keep asking questions, when everyone else seems to be content to look the other way. But then I remember it's listeners like you, people who refuse to accept what they're told at face value, those who dig deeper, those who want the truth even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. I appreciate each and every one of you for that. It's your curiosity that keeps the search alive. Today's episode is special. It's actually a listener request. That's right. I'm not the only one out there chasing shadows and mysteries. If you've got something that's been nagging you, something you can't quite explain, I want to hear about it. Feel free to email me at truthandshadowpodcast@gmail.com. That's truthandshadowpodcast@gmail.com. And who knows? Your question could be the next one I investigate. After all, we know the truth is out there, and we'll find it together, piece by piece. Let's get into today's topic. Baphomet. You've heard the name. Maybe it sends a chill down your spine, or maybe it conjures images of secret societies, occult rituals, things that go bump in the night. But is it really something to fear, or have we made it that way? In the minds of many Christians, Baphomet is the ultimate boogeyman, the symbol par excellence of chaos, evil, and darkness. It may even be a name that's become synonymous with everything we're told to avoid. But what if I told you that Baphomet is just a reflection of our own misunderstandings? What if I told you that the power we attribute to this symbol doesn't come from it, but from us? We're going to take a walk through history, through the strange and the winding roads that lead us to this symbol. We'll explore the Templars, the Cathars, and the way Baphomet has been twisted and reshaped by those seeking to control or exploit fear. This isn't merely about history. This is about demystifying something that has held too much sway for far too long. Symbols only have the power we give them. Once we understand where they come from and why they were used, we can strip away the fear. Baphomet has been used to scare, to confuse, to cast doubt. We'll expose the truth behind the myth. We'll take away the shadows, and what's left? Just a symbol, a name, a word. And that's all it ever was. In the end, we have the power to overcome because we understand. And when we understand, the things that once held us in fear no longer have that hold. Remember, it's not the dark that's dangerous. It's what we imagine lives within it. So let's turn on the lantern and see what's really there. For centuries, this enigmatic figure has been tied to the Knights Templar, secret societies, and whispered conspiracies about the nature of power and knowledge. But what if the truth is far stranger than myth? Our guest, historian and author, dares to unravel this mystery. In her new book, she traces Baphomet's origins from occult symbolism to its deeper, esoteric meanings, an exploration into humanity's oldest fears. She is the rogue historian, rebel scholar, and renegade archaeologist. Dr. Lynn, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here.
So your newest book is all about Baphomet.
It is indeed. Baphomet Revealed, Mysteries and Magic of the Sacred Icon. So it's turned a few heads because the idea of something being sacred, the idea of it being an icon can sometimes have dual meanings. And so literally I would ask people not to judge the book by the cover and enter it with an open mind because it's a history and historiography. So I hope in this book I can reveal some of the mysteries of Baphomet. Maybe demystify the symbol a little bit.
Right. Yeah, it's published by Red Wheel Weiser.
Yeah, I think it's under the New Page imprint of Red Wheel Weiser.
And it's available everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. Let's begin with some of the mysterious origins of this idea of the Baphomet. And that'll bring us all the way back in time to right around the 12th century and the formation of an order that has some serious mystery involved in it, and that would be the Knights Templar. Can you paint me a picture of what's going on in the world at this time?
Yeah, so it's probably one of the first significant mentions of Baphomet would appear during the trials of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Before that, there's just sort of rumors and scant reports, but you really do, when you start to trace it back, get some pretty solid information from the records of the court cases. And it's quite astounding, really, when you dig into this research to find the transcripts of these court cases just sort of available and translated and very in-depth. And again, bear in mind, it's from the early 14th century. So quite fascinating, and it gives you a lot to pull from. Although some of it is maybe a little murky and contradictory in some areas. And with that, you have to remember the politics of the time and the fact that the accounts were sometimes given in duress. Some of the Templars were being tortured in order to give their statements, and it's not clear as to where their allegiances may have lied. So you have to just take that with a grain of salt. But it is particularly interesting that we have such great records of it. And so what the records were, specifically in these trials, were that the Templars were accused of heresy. And so under torture, some of them did confess to worshiping an idol that was referred to as Baphomet. But the actual evidence linking them to this figure is still scant. So this is where the mystery lies. It's sort of a question of what is this Baphomet? There's a few theories. I think one of the most perhaps popular ones is that the word Baphomet is a misinterpretation of the name of Muhammad. So it reflected the medieval Christian misunderstanding of Islam, sort of in the pronunciation of Muhammad being of Mahomet and Muhammad, and some of this was sort of described as being overheard. So there were accounts that people overheard the Templars speaking in this way, and if you just can imagine this time and place, their accents wouldn't have quite been the same. So this would have been one of the most popular theories about the origin of at least the word Baphomet. And so some Crusaders believe that the Muslims were worshiping idols. That was a very popular idea then. And so this linguistic distortion may have evolved into the idea of Baphomet being seen as a demonic figure. Because if you consider the definition of a demon in that sense, it would be whichever entity or creature was in opposition to that faith. And so this was kind of a general idea. So the symbol we recognize today as Baphomet being the goat-headed androgynous figure, wasn't actually popularized until the 19th century. So there is this big gap. And so there's hints and clues along the way about what maybe it could have been. And that ranges from things like a floating head. I think in the book I have a manuscript photograph that shows sort of an account of what it would have been like, and it was just a human head that was floating. So that's not quite a goat head per se, but that was just the idea of maybe the head itself. Some accounts had them worshiping a cat. Again, a lot of this was pulled from whether it was rumors, people overhearing things, or also then the trials being under duress. It's just very unclear as to what they were potentially worshiping. I think that's why the idea of them perhaps being caught in a prayer to Muhammad might be a little closer to the truth, because the Templars were sort of starting to assimilate a bit. I mean, they were far removed from the faith. They had their faith, but they would have inevitably been influenced by those around them in the Islamic world and taken on some of those ideas. So I don't think it would be too far of a stretch to think that they perhaps were dabbling with ideas of another faith. But again, it's not clear, and we don't really see this idea of the goat in the symbol that we would recognize now as Baphomet, introduced in that period.
Yeah, we see the rise in the Holy Land with the Crusades, and then obviously these Templar Knights, and they get quarters really close to where Solomon's temple would have been, hence the inspiration for their name. But during the same time period, there's a group of Muslims who are, well, they're not exactly fans of the Shia Muslim regime that's kind of been taking over the Muslim world, and they go off to their own little area and they become known as the Assassins. And we see plenty of evidence that shows that the Templars and the Assassins had kind of a working relationship, maybe a relationship of convenience. Can you talk about the Assassins for a minute and how they can connect with the Templars?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, later you will find some more developed theories about the name, and it has to do with, say, like Gnosticism and this sort of thing, but it doesn't come about until a little bit later. So it's like more along the lines of that association of the Templars having engaged with others who were Muslim and their belief sets, and also bringing in some of the possible Islamic mysticism components and all of that. So the Assassins, they specifically were linked to the origins of Baphomet through some theories that suggested that the Templars came into contact with these sort of secretive Gnostic texts from Islam, specifically in this secretive sect. Their interaction influenced both Templars to kind of go into these heretical practices as alleged, and the subsequent myth of Baphomet. And so there was a group called the Nizari Ismailis, and they are, now we call them the Assassins. But the original group was a group that were radical Shias during the Crusades, and so they were against the Sunnis. They were renowned for political assassinations and secret operations. So this is where we get the idea of an assassination attempt. It's a very specific sort of attempt on an opposition, political opposition through these secretive means. And they were brutal. These were very much groups that were feared because they had this sort of precision. And so they were in opposition inherently then to the Templars, because the Templars' role was to protect the pilgrims who would be going into, well, one of their assignments, we'll say, one of their roles was to protect the pilgrims that would go into the Holy Land. Well, the Assassins were very much in opposition to this project, and they were very good at what they're doing. And so there's this idea of these kind of violent interactions between the two or something to that effect. So you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be an alliance. However, there are historical records that indicate that despite their very different religious backgrounds, the Assassins and the Templars had political and diplomatic interactions. This included specifically truces and alliances against their common enemies, such as the Sunnis. So it was one of those, the enemy of my enemy is, my friend kind of thing. So they kind of grouped together against these Sunnis. And so some scholars speculate that through this interaction, the Templars may have opened the door then to this esoteric knowledge from the Assassins, who could have included spiritual or philosophical concepts that we would maybe think of mysticism or Gnosticism or something to that effect, but of course would be labeled heresy by the church. So one theory posits that the Assassins' doctrine, including their practice of covert operations and secret rituals, influenced the Templars and led to their worship of Baphomet specifically. And so they were accused, the Assassins, of engaging in those esoteric practices. One of the things in particular, though, that stands out is the use of a specific form of heresy. It is called the taqiyya, and it is one of the things that I think you could say that the Assassins introduced. It's a part of Islamic thought to some degree that was very new to maybe the West. And this is the idea of sort of religious dissimulation, where someone conceals their true belief under persecution. So it's almost like a rubber stamp to say, hey, it's okay to lie. You can not just lie, but you can do sins. You can do blasphemy, heresy, whatever you need to do in order to save yourself and also perhaps be a martyr. I mean, there's all of these different things. It's almost like the ends justify the means. And if you just think about where the Templars were coming from in that worldview, of course, this is not a new idea to sort of conceal and to do this very human behavior, but that it would have been condoned in a religious or political or religio-political sect would have been sort of a new idea, and something that, if you consider the Templars and their accusations of them saying they perhaps spit on the cross or did something that would be very blasphemous and heretical in their beliefs, this explained then why they could have done that in order to sort of deflect or not show their true spiritual inclinations. So it is a bit speculative, but it is something that other scholars have put across as perhaps one of the reasons that they were able to get persecuted in such a way and still maintain, even under duress, some of their testimony, but then some of it being contradictory. But what we get from that are those accounts that seem very anti-Templar mindset, very anti-Christian, that they would be doing these blasphemous things. And so it sort of has that explanation built in. So again, speculative, but not completely, I think, far from it. But then this idea of Baphomet as being a symbol of esoteric knowledge, the Assassins had a rich mystical heritage, and they were seen by many in the area as keepers of hidden wisdom. They were a force to be reckoned with. They had this hidden wisdom, and they knew how to keep their power as well. And so if the Templars had absorbed any of that knowledge, it could have explained why Baphomet came to be associated with these secret teachings, and it could have also explained this sort of Islamic angle. But this interpretation sort of lends itself to Baphomet becoming a metaphor for the pursuit of, say, Gnosticism or forbidden knowledge, which was a central theme to these mystical traditions, especially those tied to the Assassins in particular. So essentially, it appears as though they started to share an esoteric doctrine that was maybe initially based on just a political treaty, a truce to form an alliance against their enemies. So that could have been what the catalyst was to open the door to the Templars having this appreciation, shall we say, for esotericism and Gnosticism, and then when they are practicing that then later, and then it's witnessed and it does not look anything like the Christianity that people expect from them, then it's easy to see that they were doing something heretical and then having to be held accountable for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the major drives during this same time period is the rediscovery of a lot of Greek texts that had gone missing. Like I said, if we look at the picture, we paint some history here. There was some massive plagues that had wiped out a lot of Europe at one point in time. Lots of libraries got burned down in the process. And there was a lot of knowledge and information that was lost. Well, except for the Muslims. The Muslims, at this time, they really gathered information from around the world and they disseminated it into their own language, writing countless works into Arabic and really working to save some ancient knowledge and information. And some of that stuff was obviously Gnostic texts, and other things like Aristotle. The rediscovery of Aristotle in the 13th century can be traced back to the Muslims and the fact that they had kept a lot of these Greek texts and once again translated them. And so there's no doubt that these guys had obviously some kind of information, some kind of knowledge that had been lost to Christendom. And anybody who's an intelligiophile or someone who's really into books is going to dive headfirst into that.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, it was sometimes scholars refer to it as the Islamic Golden Age, but during the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, there were centers like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. They did a lot of this translating of key philosophical works and scientific texts from the Greek sources into Arabic. And so, yes, scholars are translating works by Aristotle, Plato, Pythagoras, and all sorts of people. And in that period saw the rise of falsafa, which is Islamic philosophy, and a sort of renewed focus on mysticism, cosmology, and it really influenced Islamic mysticism and Sufism in particular. And so the connection to Baphomet, and it having this sort of maybe even a Greek background is another etymological connection that's been speculated. Some researchers have said that the name Baphomet could actually have derived from Greek words bapha, meaning baptism or immersion, and metis, meaning wisdom or knowledge. And so this would frame Baphomet as a symbol of initiation and immersion into esoteric knowledge, and that sort of thing. And so, again, it's hard to really trace down any of the absolutes on this, but you can see, as you said, there is this world that we can envision where there were a lot of texts lost in Christendom, and the Islamic Golden Age was golden in such that it was preserving a lot of these ancient texts, and not just preserving them, but expanding on them. People were practicing this, and so it could be quite alluring to the Templars, particularly when you consider knowledge as power. And as much as the Templars maybe initially appear as though they were sort of impoverished and very, very much, humble and giving and all of this, they were very much seeking power. There's without a doubt, because they gathered so much money and so much influence, and it's just human nature to kind of go further and push further in that direction. So if they saw these translation movements and things around them giving them sort of more power, then of course I think that that's something that would have influenced them very much so. And I personally think there's no doubt that it did. But it's just the idea of trying to nail down what exactly is Baphomet in that context. And so there are those explanations. So it's hard to say, but I do think it's linked to the Islamic philosophy and Sufism and assassins, and you could call it the corruption of the Templars if you were looking at it from that paradigm of, anti-Islamic studies versus like pro-Christendom or that sort of thing. It really just depends on the worldview, but at least a change or a shift in the Templar perspective, and then ultimately their goals at that point.
Well, that leads me to my next question, and that involves at the same time, I think it's the 13th century in France. There's a movement that the church history records them as the Albigensians. They called themselves maybe the Cathars. Whatever they are, we don't really have a whole lot of surviving documents from them, because most of the stuff we have was from the Inquisitors and the conquerors, namely the Roman Church in this particular instance. But we do know that the Knights Templar may have interacted with the Cathar movement, because there seems to have been a draw, at least some kind of draw, of the Templars and specifically Montségur in France. And do you go into the Cathars and their particular belief systems?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's primarily because of the dualistic beliefs of the Cathars, and the Baphomet figure being one that represents this dualism. But they, as you said, they were a Christian sect that came out of Europe, particularly southern France, during about the 12th and 13th centuries, around then. So they're often connected to discussions about Baphomet because of their esoteric traditions. And while there's not really a lot of documentation about them, there's enough, I would say, for scholars to make this connection. So the connection being that they had this shared esoteric knowledge and even practices, particularly due to their proximity in southern France, where both groups were significantly influenced by that region, and they were sort of there. You can see the evidence of that in the castles and the art that's still in the region. But some of the theories suggest the Templars were influenced by the Cathars' dualism during their time in France and their exposure to Eastern traditions and while on crusade. So this almost like an amalgamation of these Islamic beliefs and this Cathar belief. But what kind of binds them still, even though one, like the Cathars being primarily Christian and Islam, of course, being Islamic, is still what brought them together was this thread or undercurrent of Gnosticism. So it was as though they were kind of blending this. And so while the historical evidence connecting the two groups is limited to an extent, it does show this common thread. Could it be coincidence? Perhaps, but the modern view of it in later centuries came about having to do with the conspiracy theories that emerged, and some different accounts that were lost in different churches, and different groups too, like Freemasons and Rosicrucians, all claiming a connection to these ancient traditions. And so it really put it back up into the framework of inquiry that, hey, perhaps these were connected. And so more people look back on this and would do an analysis, a deeper analysis, and say, are these connected just by happenstance or because they share this Gnostic viewpoint, or is there any evidence of sort of cross-pollination between these two ideas? And of course, probably the biggest idea that came out of that was the modern esoteric writers suggesting that Cathars possess knowledge of the mystical practices associated with the Holy Grail, if not having the Holy Grail altogether, which then link them to the legends back to the Templars and Baphomet and the Solomon's Treasure and all of these connections. So they're found in alternative historical narratives. They are considered alternative because they don't necessarily have that concrete historical evidence, but they persist to this day because of the mysterious and secretive nature of those groups, but also by the secretive nature of the Catholic Church to this day, with having the Vatican archives and things that scholars have not been able to readily access easily. So, but they do have this this very distinct kind of connection to the Gnostic view of dualism. It's a central theme of both the Cathars, and then to that extent, then the Templars, but particularly through the icon of Baphomet. So in the Catholic dualism, for instance, and they believe that there was a good God in the spiritual realm, and it was created by a benevolent and all-powerful God, and this realm was pure and immaterial and therefore good. And then there was an evil God, or a demiurge. This was the God of the material world, created by a malevolent being or spirit that was then sometimes identified with the God of the Old Testament, or even Satan. And so you could see this is then the world was corrupt and evil and a trap for the souls. And so you could see how that could pose a problem to the Christian worldview at that point. But for the Cathars, human beings were essentially these divine souls trapped in corrupt material bodies. And the goal then, according to their beliefs, was to escape the material world through spiritual purity, the rejection of the body. And their view of salvation came through spiritual enlightenment and liberation from the flesh. And in their view, that allowed their soul to return to the realm of the good God. And so it heavily was influenced by Gnostic tradition if anyone knows of Gnosticism, this sounds very familiar. The physical world is viewed as the creation of a lower ignorant deity, like the demiurge, and salvation comes through secret knowledge, like gnosis. And then, of course, we go back to the pleroma, which is this all. And so this was a threatening view at the time, and in some ways still is, but it attracted a lot of people, and most likely the Templars.
Yeah, there's a lot of this connection in the Gnostic circles. You have, the ultimate wisdom, which is Sophia. Maybe even the personification of wisdom is Sophia. And then, which would be transcendent wisdom, right? I mean, the ultimate idea of wisdom that some have alluded to. This is the wisdom that Solomon is writing about in his Proverbs, or in the Wisdom of Solomon texts in the Bible. And he's talking about Sophia, not something else. And at the same time, if you have transcendent wisdom, there's a potential for immanent wisdom, right? Or wisdom that is of a material nature, represented by dualism, right? There's male, there's female, there's good, bad, there's all these dualistic things going on. And it seems that there's a draw between these two forms of wisdom. I mean, so much so that it influenced individuals from, Paracelsus way back in Greek times, all the way up to, it inspires people today. Obviously, there's Gnostic practitioners today, but, figures like Aleister Crowley, Eliphas Levi, who is kind of at the root of the new imaging of the Baphomet symbol.
Yeah, no, for sure. Without it, Sophia, there's a definite Sophia connection here, at least in even those later interpretations. Sophia and Baphomet share a lot of symbolic connections from Gnosticism and their androgyny and dualism. In many Gnostic texts, Sophia's fall is tied to the division between the spiritual and material realms, and so she's striving to reconcile these opposites. And similarly, that's the vision of Baphomet, as being this blend of both male and female attributes. So while Sophia we often refer to as female, in this Gnostic mindset, it sort of is a balance of these polarities. And so it represents, as you said, this wisdom. Sophia's wisdom, esoteric knowledge, the pursuit of enlightenment. But Baphomet is especially sort of looked at in this way in that 19th century occult worldview, stemming from Eliphas Levi's representation of the idea of this duality and balance. He depicts Baphomet as this androgynous being, symbolizing the unity of the opposites, masculine and feminine, good and evil, material and spiritual. And so in the same sense as Sophia, Baphomet is meant to challenge us to move beyond those binaries, to seek some sort of deeper integrated understanding of the universe, at least in Levi's mind. And there has been a speculative link between the two in the form of the what's called the Atbash cipher, an ancient code, when applied to the word Baphomet, can be translated to Sophia in Greek. So it's another idea of, well, where does the name Baphomet come from? And again, there's many different ideas, and one of them is really associated with Sophia. It suggests that Baphomet could be this symbol sort of stand-in for the divine wisdom, like Sophia. So it just shows another view of hidden wisdom. I think in some ways we kind of, if we imagine Sophia based in maybe Greek myth or something, we imagine a female, probably the masculine, and arguably unattractive. So it seems like they would be very much opposite, and that may even be an extra, connection between the two. I don't necessarily want to say an occult blind, but something that could also represent that dualism. But again, a lot of that's speculative, but it could be all of the above in a lot of ways, because these authors were inspired by these connections, and they were seeking to reimagine but also reinstill these connections in new ways, or sort of represent them in ways that would be appreciated now, or at their time at least. And so, Crowley, like you said, that's a subsequent reimagining, and you just see this with this icon, this image being shifted throughout all of this history. So it could be something from a floating head or a cat to maybe some vague idea of Sophia, and maybe the idea of Sophia as a female goddess, all the way to this goat of Mendes, and what we see now on the Church of Satan, and all of these different logos. And I mean, even now, I would say in a more contemporary focus, we've seen some strange iteration of Baphomet appearing in pop culture, where it's been neotenized almost like a Sanrio figure and put on children's clothing and all sorts of things. And so it's like this cute little goat creature, and it's meant to just be somewhat subversive, but also disarming, which in a way, if you were to look at it as a negative icon or something nefarious, I would think that its representation as something very cute and neotenized is probably more nefarious than the Levi's drawing, which is clearly more frightening to look at.
Yeah, aiming something at children is usually really scary if it's a nefarious item, But they do the same thing. See, the thing is they have these same figures with Cthulhu too. So
exactly.
So the H.P. Lovecraft mythos with Cthulhu can also be represented in these same kind of little cutesy, kind of kidsy figures. And so, I mean, if you just draw the conclusion that somebody's, making money off of an item, that's what someone's doing. At the end of the day, it was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I have noticed that. Yeah.
Right. Well, If we look at dualism, we also can look at the Templars coin. The Templars coin is, you could describe the symbolism there for a brief moment and how interesting that is.
Yeah. So it is. To look at it in the context of dualism, you see this image of a horse. They're knights, but there's two of them on one horse. And so it's at first sort of described as showing that the knights were committed to sacred vows of poverty and obedience, because, oh, look, we don't even have one horse per person. So, yeah. But it could also be read as just that, two figures on one horse. So something unified, but yet dual at the same time. I think that's a probably more appropriate way of looking at it, that the perhaps exoteric view is that they were showing their frugality, but the esoteric view was showing their duality.
Well, yeah, considering I do believe the horse depicted is more like what we would call an American quarter horse, which two people fully armed and armored would not be able to ride upon on a horse safely. I'm just going to point that little factoid out. There's more going on. This is not a draft horse being depicted. It's a much smaller animal, and you put two fully armored humans on there, and we're spelling disaster.
Yeah. So definitely a symbol.
We get into the Templars fall, the Cathars fall. Oh, well, supposedly the last massacre at Montesegura occurs in the 13th century. The last, quote unquote, last leader of the Templars dies in the 14th century. And then we have this kind of period of esoteric stillness, if you will, until the rise of the Renaissance, where we get a new interest into the occult. I mean, once again, we do draw the fact that a lot of these Greek manuscripts were gone from Western Europe for several hundred years. So they're being rediscovered in Italy and Great Britain. They're being renewed into the scholastic era of the intelligentsia, and we see occultism and alchemy come back.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, the Renaissance is, you see a huge revival of interest in Greek philosophy, mysticism, and occult knowledge. It's profoundly influenced Western tradition. And so figures like Baphomet also became associated with these currents. Rediscovery of translations of those ancient Greek manuscripts, like ones related to Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and all of that sort of paved the way for a new interest in the occult. And it wasn't just this return to a classical wisdom, but instead it was a search for hidden mystical knowledge. And as you said, it resonated deeply with the intellectuals of the time and people at a different sort of class, an emerging class too, of the merchant class. And so that was sort of an important time where you have, I wouldn't call it necessarily a free market yet at all, but you had a shift in the social stratification with the rise of big families like Medici's or banking families who really started to make a lot of money, so much so that they were having the power over the church because they were lending money to the church. But they still had this relationship with the church that was hand in hand. They didn't want to usurp it. They just sort of infiltrated sometimes as Medici's becoming popes or this sort of thing. But So you see this just generically in the Renaissance with something like Brunelleschi's dome. You start to see this, we're going to build this great monument. Now it is still a church, but look at our power visibly. It showed they did a lot of artistic works, patronage of monuments and buildings, sacred architecture, all of this, often for the church, at least in name, but it was really a way that they could visibly assert their power to the masses and win them over too. And so this was a sort of a time of struggle between what we could say the regular people and the church, or the laity, although these were arguably not just regular people because of their now newfound wealth, but because they had that newfound wealth and power, in a sense, over the church, they didn't have to necessarily spend their money on just promoting the Christian ideas. And so they were responsible in retrieving a lot of these ancient texts and then introducing them to the intelligentsia. And it was like an injection of new information, perhaps like the internet, getting all of this in and people being able to just say, hold on, wait a minute, what is Neoplatonism, or how does this work? And in an earlier time, I think, had these ideas been available, it would have been quickly shut down. Because you just see patterns of that, but because a lot of these ideas had been brought to us by the individuals during the Renaissance who had the money and the power, we see this just flood, basically, the so-called market. And so you have the Corpus Hermeticum, which was attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus. It was rediscovered and translated into Latin during this period. And it just really led to Renaissance thinkers having this deep quest for knowledge and understanding, both of the natural world and the divine. And they wanted to bridge the gap between science, religion, and magic in a lot of ways. And so in this climate, Baphomet, yes, it was sort of a quiet time for the occult. But I think it was probably because a lot of people were just in this process of retrieving all of those texts and trying to make of it what they could. But you don't necessarily see Baphomet reemerge then until later. So there is this big gap between, say, the medieval period and then the 19th century.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because, well, during the Renaissance period, you have the rise of individuals like Henrik Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy. But he didn't do that until pretty much like 2 years before he dies. He finishes these books of occult philosophy. And he was also known as a polymath and a theologian for the Catholic Church. And that's what's interesting, because we come again into the 1800s and we find not just individuals like Agrippa, who's a theologian in the church, is writing occult texts, but then we find an individual who is a Catholic theologian, Alphonse Louis Constant, writing about esoteric things. And here we have the re-envisioning of the Baphomet figure from something that might have, like you said, a floating head, a goat of Mendes, a cat maybe, into something that we can now tangibly almost recreate artistically everywhere.
Yeah, it's it's kind of humorous when you put it that way. Just, throw in a cat, why don't you? It's just, there's so much speculation until Levi. So yeah, this is probably, if anyone knows Baphomet by name, or if you just Google Baphomet, you're going to come up with this very distinct drawing in black and white. And this is the one that is given to us as the fully formed Baphomet. So that image was illustrated by, as you said, Eliphas Levi. And it may come as a surprise, I think, to some people who may not be familiar. But Levi did not start out as an occultist. He was actually eventually a pivotal figure in occultism. But he started out as a priest. And he was very devout, no less. So he was from France, and he was born in 1810. So right around the time he's coming up, there's a lot of different social changes and a lot of different things bubbling up, political movements in particular. And he starts to get involved in some of the philosophy behind these political movements. But he was very, very deeply religious. He also got into a little bit of trouble here and there with what he was accused of as being maybe, I don't know, there's some evidence or some accusations of him trying to date students. So he's sort of looked at as maybe a figure that wasn't on the up and up, maybe. Now, he says that he didn't do these things. There's a lot of different, accounts here or there. But he was coming into a lot of trouble, and they ended up moving him to a different church. And so he's starting to feel a little bit like the church isn't with him, the church is against him. He's still looking in these magical practices. He's starting to feel that there's some bit of hypocrisy in the church as well. And he has this idea of Catholicism and what he feels is true Catholicism. And this kind of demonstrates his view of the politics at the time, because he views true Catholicism not as what the church was offering, but as socialism, essentially. And he got very much into socialism as a movement, and he saw it as a way to promote what he viewed as true Catholicism, this true sort of universal, this coming together of everybody. So you get this, essentially a young guy who has had it, and he decides to leave and pursue the occult 100%. So he changes his name, and he writes his seminal work, in 1854. It's Dogma et Ritual de la Magie, and he has a success on his hands, which is interesting because a lot of these sort of esoteric books, they seem mystical and fascinating to those who are interested. We don't necessarily think of them as bestsellers, but his book actually became a bestseller. It was kind of mainstreamed. He was a big socio-political figure, and there were enthusiasts all around that admired him, and he became a little bit famous. And so he ends up doing this amazing work. It's very, very extensive. And so he made his way through intellectual crowds and artists especially. And so part of the reason he was able to do that was because he started to have this view of mysticism and the occult, but also with these like modern so-called sensibilities of, say, socialism or political discussion and rational argumentation. And so he was really a product of his time. And so it starts to then dovetail with this romantic movement of the period, which tried to reclaim some of the enchantment of the world after the Enlightenment. And so he was just in the right place at the right time. And his work essentially echoed these post-Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, who were skeptical about dogmatic beliefs. And Levi described Voltaire as having what he called a sneering and derisive philosophy. So he was really, again, just a product of this kind of place and time. And I guess he was what they needed at the time. And by they, I mean the intellectual elites and the artists and whatnot. So he creates this figure of Baphomet, and he kind of vaguely traces it to the Knights Templar. And it was this sort of idea that he instills onto this icon, and it quite literally was an icon. He wanted it to be something that you would meditate on, which sounds, again, a little wild if you see the picture as he drew it, because it's kind of, well, a little bit spooky looking. It's not very pretty. And so when we think of icons in a sort of Christian sense, you think of maybe something beautiful, illuminated, whatever. This was just not the case. And so in the book, I kind of go through and just sit on that image for a little while and go through an analysis of the individual symbols and what they do mean, because it's sort of it's complicated. There are a lot of things he included, like the goat head itself, or the pentagram on the forehead, and the torch between the horns, and all of it was meant to symbolize this merging of the two. So another sense of duality here. But he thought that this would be a representation of the equilibrium of these opposites, and he had this concept that he put forth called the astral light, which is very influential even now in the occult. It's a kind of a hallmark cornerstone concept, but he referred to it as the astral light, and he thought this could serve as a visual embodiment of this light. And again, if you are not someone who has read about the occult or some of these belief sets, you could look at this dark figure and say, well, I just can't see how something like that could represent that astral light or something that seems so positive to people. And that's, again, why it's such an enigmatic figure, and one that needed an analysis to really go through and trace, like, why would these people think such things? And why is it associated? Why could it have been a symbol that maybe initially meant something positive, or at least the intent was that it was positive, and how could it be really something so negative? Or what is the pattern there? And so so hopefully I kind of analyze that enough in the book for people. Again, and when I start the book, I am sure to tell people this is not an this book is not an apology. I'm not an apologist for Baphomet. It may come across that way simply because I'm not saying throughout this is evil, this is scary, this is terrible, but because I'm trying to just give a nuanced understanding of why or how people would come to these conclusions, and maybe bring people to that understanding of what Baphomet is to some people, and then let them make up their own mind.
Yeah, absolutely. The image of Baphomet requires some form of looking at, not a normalization of the image, of course, but an analysis of we're not trying to desensitize individuals to the image. That would be unfair as well. I mean, the purpose is to have an informed intellect, right? We need to understand what something is. And part of the informed intellect is understanding one of the key phrases that has kind of been part of the whole interview, and that really is the word inspire, right? To be inspired by something. If we look, the Templars were obviously inspired by something to do, from being the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon to what they rose and became. Or we look at what the Cathars or the Albigensians, what inspired them to have this understanding that a man or a woman can be priest, and what it would mean for other groups of individuals through time to be inspired by a transcendent wisdom. In this case, for the Gnostics, Sophia. For other individuals, the Holy Spirit as part of the triune God. And so we're looking at to be inspired. And in another one of your books, Evil Archaeology, you actually talk about what this means. And let's just close with the idea of to be inspired, and how these individuals may have been inspired through time, and what it could mean potentially to understand where a symbol like this can come from.
I mean, that's a very good point, because it is important to look at the inspiration, because we can see, as we discussed, Levi being a product of his time, so and a product of his circumstances. So his motivation and his inspiration, essentially, to make this Baphomet figure is going to be different than, say, the Templars for perhaps worshiping it, or even a contemporary satanic religious movement to adopt it, or any of these things. And there is an underlying thread, though, that can be seen through the idea of a transformative process or transformation, and the idea of something being unified. And so and if you're looking at maybe that monomythic structure underneath it all, I think Baphomet has appealed to people for so long because it reinforces this transformative possibility. And so you could see you could look at that as neutral. You could say, transformative, maybe that's positive. But you could also see it in a negative way if you look at movements later about, say, transhumanism, or these ideas of, we're going to transcend our current existence and go into something completely different. And so, but it really captures this idea, this inclination people have had to somehow transform or ascend or go to this different level or create something anew. And so then it's like, well, what inspires them to do that? And so when you look at the word inspire, it comes from the Latin inspirare, which literally would mean to breathe into. And so it's specifically in ancient uses refer to the act of breathing life or something into an entity by a god or by a divine or spiritual being. And so it was very much about this notion of something discarnate that would breathe or impart an idea onto you. And then you would be inspired. That person would have a particular feeling or an idea, mostly in a creative or spiritual context. And this connection to breathing also suggests this life-giving or motivating force. So much like how someone would be filled with creativity or insight. And so it's like the animating spirit. And so in a way too, this connects a little bit to the idea of the anima or the soul or life, the root concept of animation. And so it is to be inspired was specifically this giving lifelike qualities, giving the animating spirit to somebody. So it really is about something spiritual, but coming from somewhere else. You could look at it in the Greek sense as perhaps the muses. There's all of these ideas of spirit sort of breathing or whispering something and just getting you to be motivated to perhaps do their bidding. But either way, it is something to consider because that is arguably magical. It's magical because what you're able to do then is create action from a distance. You have your will, and you can impart that will at no matter what the time and space is. So if you consider more of an academic view of what magic is, you could make the argument that Baphomet is a magical icon because Eliphas Levi, when he drew this, imbued it with these ideas. He wanted a certain outcome, a certain feeling to be had, and he's been long gone, and he left this mark. And when you view this mark, a piece of art, now in 2024, you may be moved. You may feel something, whether that's fear, disdain, confusion, intrigue, whatever you're feeling in this magical context because Eliphas Levi willed us to through this drawing. So it's I guess you could call it maybe the weaponization of psychology, but in a way that's what magic has been, is a proto-psychology often used to manipulate and ensure that your will is done. Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, as they say.
Yeah, we were talking about your new book. It's available. Baphomet Revealed, The Mysteries and Magic of the Sacred Icon. Well, where could people find more of Dr. Heather Lynn? And tell the audience your new thing. You're doing classes.
Yeah, that's my new thing. You can go to my website to see everything you need to know. It's drheatherlynn.com. That's drheatherlynn.com. And there you'll find my books and links. And my books are in stores everywhere and Amazon and all the regular places. There's also an audiobook coming out at the same time. So if you're not one to sit down and read through the entire thing, you can listen to it. And that's always a good option. But currently, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm doing something a little bit different. I had recently retired from my professorship and have launched a new endeavor, and that is bringing courses to people about maybe we'll call them fringe topics, because I find that there's a lot of confusion about some of these topics, and a lot of people in the sphere of influence who are looking for just that influence, and they're not looking to necessarily educate people and empower people with the tools needed to go out into the depths of the rabbit holes and find truth. But instead they maybe have their version of truth and they say, I have discovered it, here's what I know. And then they kind of, in some ways, indoctrinate. And so that's what I try to stay away from. I try to present all views of things and trust the process and trust individuals. And so I've been doing, firstly, the Anunnaki class. I have a course on the Anunnaki. So for anyone interested in that, that is available. And I will be doing more courses. And as my expertise is limited into what it is that I do, there's a interest in courses that maybe are fringe, but not where I am a specialist. And so for that, I've been partnering with other creators to develop new classes that they can facilitate and bring their knowledge to everybody. And so the goal is to make sort of an alternative university online where we can all get together and have a community and learn some things in a somewhat safe but intellectually challenging environment. I say somewhat safe because these are dangerous ideas, but we should be safe enough to be able to play with those dangerous ideas and support each other in doing so, and not fear that, okay, I'm going to talk about Baphomet and now I get judged. Or a lot of people have those fears. They may be interested in topics that are maybe not spoken about in their day-to-day lives and their regular circle of people that they interact with. And so this hopefully can act as a bridge to different relationships and opportunities to share that knowledge, maybe expand on it, hopefully, as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It is always such a good time speaking to you. You're always so well versed in all of the subject matter. So it really is a pleasure. I come away learning so much from you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.